Chuck, it's great to see you today.
Thanks, Jason.
So, Chuck, you were a squadron leader in the Navy's SEAL Team 6, and you follow very carefully the war in Ukraine. But you're also carefully observing what Russia is doing globally. And you've noticed, as everyone else, I'm sure, that Russia's had a lot of setbacks recently, especially in the past week. If we look at Syria, the Assad regime collapsed. We see the effect that's going to have in Africa. We see what's happening with the Russian economy domestically. It's just a mess for Russia everywhere they look. Now, what do you see?
Well, you and I were just speaking before we went on. So many times people and analysts, they look at the small picture and study the small picture in detail, and they don't quite look at the big picture. Let's put it this way. So Russia has done a lot this summer to capture a handful of villages that no one heard of. Some of them aren't even villages, they're hamlets, they're crossroads. In one case, Rivnopil, it's a bunch of barns in the middle of nowhere. And they traded that effort, and they have lost their principal overseas colony of Syria. In a week, they lost that. But that has also cut them off from a very important effort they had going in Africa. And you and I both see this as predicated on some specific events. And I think that most of the media has missed what you and I think are the seminal event that started all of this.
So, looking at it, where do you think it began? Where did it all start to fall apart for Russia?
The October 7th attack by Hamas, you and I, a lot of other counter-terrorist analysts looked at that and said, this was a watershed moment operationally for Hamas. They had never pulled off an operation of this scale or magnitude, this articulate a plan. This was, everyone thought, beyond their operational capability, beyond their striking power. Immediately, travel patterns from Hamas leaders were noted. They had traveled to Tehran, they had traveled to Moscow in the weeks and months preceding the attack. Ergo, I draw the conclusion, as a lot of other counter-terrorist analysts did, Russia and Iran were involved in the planning for the October 7th attack. We both are familiar with the concept of blowback. You commit an operational act, and it has the exact opposite effect of what you'd like. Well, take a large view at this. Hamas strikes Egypt on the 7th of October. They wind up being attacked root and branch in Gaza. Their patron, Iran, exchanges multiple ballistic missile strikes on Israel, and Russia looks gleefully on. Well, here we are, 23 months later. Syria has fallen. Iran's air defense capabilities are wiped out. Hezbollah is no more. And Iran and Russia's principal overseas joint effort is now in the hands of the rebels. That's what I'd call a pretty big fail.
It's a pretty big fail. I think it's a very fair assessment. Now, what are going to be the ramifications of that? How is this going to affect Russia's global operations?
Well, principally, this was Russia's main overseas operational base for their naval forces, and that was the naval base in Tartus. Things were happening so precipitously last week that the naval commanders in Tartus got all their vessels underway. And speaking as a former naval officer, you can't just start up a ship like a car. That's one of the reasons why you want to get way ahead of the problem. Whatever intelligence the naval commanders were getting, it was basically get the hell out of here. So they went to sea. They didn't have time necessarily to prepare those vessels for sea, to fuel them, to supply them. And what we have now is all of Russia's Mediterranean squadron drifting about in the Mediterranean on undersupplied ships, underfueled. And again, in another factor of this blowback, those warships are not going to be repatriated through the Bosphorus and into the Black Sea. They are warships. The Montreux Convention, which Turkey administers, is not going to allow those warships back into the Black Sea. So where are they going to go? The entire length of the Mediterranean into the Bay of Biscay, into the North Sea, into the Baltic, and finally to Kaliningrad. I don't think those vessels can make it. That's just the smallest L they got. As we speak right now, there are at least 4 or 5 positions where Russian troops and advisors are surrounded and cut off by rebel forces. So uh, this has been the biggest overseas defeat of Russian power since I don't know. I don't know. Maybe the Winter War. This has been a horrendous blow to their geopolitical aims.
Certainly, it seems like it's a blow, and it'll affect what Russia is currently doing, where they have regimes that they've backed to overthrow the governments, for instance, in Mali, as well as in Niger, as well as Burkina Faso. So there's going to be more pressure there. How will they supply the guys they have there? How will they continue to do operations there? How will they credibly offer security to their allies when we see what's worked out for Assad? Total disaster. He had to flee the country, and his soldiers, by the thousands in civilian clothing, are heading for the borders on foot trying to seek asylum in other countries. A total disaster for Russia. So at this point, what do you think that the Russians will do? And what impact will this have on their other global operations?
You know, we think of Russia's plans for their overseas adventure in Africa, Central Africa, just like you said. What those Wagner troops essentially are doing in those African dictatorships is they are running the slave labor that works in the metal mines, exploiting the natural resources of these countries, splitting the money with the thug de jour dictator, and making money for Moscow. These guys are totally cut off now. So try to imagine the United States conducting operations in the Western Pacific if we no longer had Hawaii. It's a problem, geographical problem of that magnitude. Russian aircraft are barely able to fly in and out of Syria. They are not able to fly straight from Russia into Central Africa. And besides, when they get there, their own logistical situations are completely up in the air. So you've got Wagner Group operators who they refer to themselves as the Africa Corps, a little bit of a branding problem there. But these people are also isolated now. So when you go up and take 100,000 foot view of this, look, Russia's overseas plans are in absolute disarray. They've now got insoluble problems. There is never going to be a Russian foothold in Russia. Think of what Russian advisors, the Russian Air Force has done to Syria in the last 13 years. That in itself is a war crime.
So now that there's no longer the allies that Russia once had, namely Hezbollah, has been decimated. And as we've discussed, in the case of Iran, they're having a lot of problems. We've recently seen, when they've tried to have war with Israel, that it doesn't work out very well. Can you give your view on that?
Yeah, there was a wrote a paper a couple of years ago talking about the geopolitical aims and the means by which they hope to achieve them used by Iran. I postulated this thing called intermediate state chaos. So Iran had the goal to project power from its own location to the coast of the Mediterranean. They did that by subverting the government in Iraq and then taking advantage of the political trouble in Syria to intervene there. But it was Iran's goal to make Bashir al-Assad a puppet and to create a land bridge to the Mediterranean. They, of course, did this through their proxy Hezbollah, which is based in Lebanon. All of that was going pretty well for most of the last decade or so. And you look what has happened now. Their proxy Hezbollah has been decapitated. Those were the most effective troops fighting on the side of Bashir Assad. They weren't effective when they didn't have their Pentagon in Beirut. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps was lacking all of the assets, all of the manpower, all of the martyrs, all of the fighters that Hezbollah brought to the table. And this confluence along with picking a fight with Israel, exchanging ballistic missiles. The net event is that Iran has no more air defenses. This land bridge operation has collapsed. Uh, all of their geopolitical work and instability and spewing chaos for the last 15 years, it all has amounted to nothing. And the thing about intermediate state chaos, meaning if you can't get what you want, you just mess everything up. That really worked well. There wasn't a remedy for that. And nobody, including myself, saw a conventional military solution to that. And that was Israel vis-a-vis Iran. And Iran came up. They're not even holding the bag anymore, Jason. The bag is gone. They lost everything.
Well, that's a shame for Iran, isn't it? It just gets worse and worse as it's getting worse and worse for Russia.
So there have been some problems as well in Russia's regional geopolitical games. And especially things don't appear to be going quite to their plan in Georgia either. And I know that you follow that very closely. What's the latest from Georgia?
Listen, in Georgia, it's really a tense situation. The government there, which is considered to be pro Russian, was able to manipulate the elections and was able to get people to vote for the party either through coercion or just through ballot stuffing, perhaps. But at this point, we see that the protests have not softened. The people in Georgia are still demanding more elections. And this is where I think we see more and more of Russia's hybrid war, manipulating elections in other countries. We saw them do the same thing in Moldova. In the first round of the elections, just barely, the referendum supporting EU membership passed. And the president won, but that was also very, very close that the pro European president won. Now, in the case of Romania, we saw what happened. Runner up in the first round of the presidential elections was a pro Russian candidate. Nobody knew who the guy was, but once again, manipulating algorithms and social media, it appears that he was able to take a strong percentage in the first round and get to the second round. But in that case, the Romanian courts have dismissed the elections and they will hold new elections. But since then, they've also been investigating this guy and have found that he does have links to others who have very, very strong ties to Moscow. So overall, we do see that Russia is trying to operate in the region. They are trying to do their best, even within democratic countries, to force change. In other countries, like the African countries that we mentioned, they do send in their Wagner group de facto, the Africa Corps, in order to take over and enslave locals and force them to work in mines and to share the booty with the local warlords.
Jason, I want to get back to Georgia for a moment. Russian history has shown us that when they're vassal states, they're satellite states, when there is political instability, Russia traditionally invades. And we saw that in East Germany. We saw that in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Afghanistan. Do you think there's any chance that the Russian army will intervene in Georgia?
So at present, I think it would be very hard for the Russian military to intervene most anywhere. Simply, Russia doesn't have the resources necessary. When we look at the collapse of Syria, it reminded me immediately of the collapse of the Soviet Union. One of the first external signs, symptoms that the Soviet Union was nearing its demise was when we started to see the inability of Moscow to suppress what was going on. They didn't have either the financial resources nor the military necessary to suppress the regimes in Eastern Europe that were allied with Moscow, their satellites, and they weren't able to also keep the local population within Russia satisfied, where there was huge deficits of everything. So looking at all this, Russia is just simply unable to. It didn't have the capacity to be able to support their allies. So what we see now, in the case of Syria, where Assad fell, he's had to flee to Moscow, and the fact that these other allies of Russia, located in Africa, for instance, are now left out to dry. Who's going to supply them? Who's going to bring them new stuff or take them out of the country? There's no plan whatsoever. Russia is starting to show a lot of symptoms that are truly similar to what we saw earlier in Russian history. And if it goes the way it is now, we could have a moment that looks like when the Soviet Union collapsed, where it just all falls apart, slowly, slowly, and then all at once. But aside from this, we see that Russia, it might be successful in some operations, but in the global picture, it's not doing nearly as well as what it might lead others to believe. In fact, Russia is having far more trouble than we've ever imagined. And just look at Ukraine, which has passed now 1,030 days of war. Russia really did believe it would take 7 to 10 days to overthrow the Ukrainian government, install a dictator, and just return its troops back to Russia as if nothing had ever happened. But that didn't happen there. So, what are you seeing, though, today in the war in Ukraine?
Well, I see a Russian army that lacks any sort of leadership. People have talked about the Russian offensive this summer, but it wasn't an offensive. An offensive is something that George Patton does. It's something that Rommel does. It is large-scale ground maneuver warfare that is aimed to capture large swaths of territory. And those are done with regiments and battalions and divisions. Russian attacks have been almost exclusively at the company and platoon level, with the rare exceptions when they do launch a battalion size strike, as they did a couple of weeks ago in Kupiansk. It took 20 minutes for the Ukrainian forces to destroy one battalion of Russian forces in maneuver. Why? Well, they were conducting an attack in broad daylight down one road, just one road, bumper to bumper. So obviously there is no tactical talent in the Russian army. They have captured over the course of this summer 1% of Ukraine. In the month of November alone, they lost 44,000 casualties. So I see this force as being stressed and at becoming increasingly brittle. An offensive operation is the easiest thing you can do in war. Attack. It's easy. Fix your bayonet, go over there and kill the enemy. The hardest thing you can do is get knocked on your butt by the enemy, scramble backwards, try to regroup, and counterattack. I don't think Russia is capable of doing those sorts of operations anymore. So that means when that glorious day comes, when Ukraine is equipped well enough to conduct offensive operations, large scale, they're going to be up against a brittle enemy, literally a paper tiger.
So, as winter approaches, I've read that it's actually on the side of the country defending itself, not on the aggressor, that winter usually favors. Is that true? And what impact will it have?
And that is definitely true. And you could put it this way: if you are occupying a defensive position that you intend to hold on to, your logistics only have to go to one place, right? They're just going to the bunker complex that you are in. That's all we've got. If you are conducting offensive operations in the winter, your logistics have to keep pressing forward. They have to keep following that moving target. Now, all sorts of things go wrong in the winter. The roads are bad, the frozen, there are blizzards, weather, etc. The other thing is we know that the Russian troops are not equipped for winter. 1 million winter uniforms got sold out of a Siberian warehouse 18 months ago. That blipped in the news, but those are important in the winter. We know the Russian soldiers don't have adequate footwear. I can tell you that the boots of a soldier don't last more than one summer. In fact, they only last a couple of weeks. That's how long boots last. If you don't have good boots in the winter, you don't have sleeping bags, you don't have a fixed position to live in because you're on the move, on the offensive, they're going to suffer environmental casualties that are off the charts, especially when your soldiers are not well fed and they get no medical attention. So this is going to be a long, cold winter for Russia as it tries to play offense in Kursk.
So, we've talked about it before that morale in the Russian military is pretty low. In fact, it's horrifically low. And I've read, in fact, that some Russian soldiers, or actually the average conscript, survives less than a month after being sent to the front. They just burn through people, they just don't care at all. So, when we look at what just happened in Syria, where the entire government's military just collapsed, the soldiers just started walking away, changing the civilian clothing, acting like they didn't even know what the army was about, and trying to get out of town before the rebels showed up. Do you think it's possible that the Russian military just one day collapses, just totally falls apart, like we just saw in Syria?
You know, it's absolutely possible. So often, when we look at dictatorial governments, as in Syria, as in Libya, as in Romania, they seem completely monolithic and enduring until that 1 second that they're not. General Gaddafi went for a drive in the morning. He got pulled out of a road culvert and torn to pieces in the afternoon. Ceausescu goes to give a Christmas time speech. 12 hours later, he's being executed. Uh, they go south fast. And that same thing happens to armies. And in not so ancient history, the Russian army on its western front, the eastern front, the Tsar's army, it collapsed almost overnight. They were treated pretty much the way Putin is treating his army. No regard for casualties, no regard for logistics, no regard for rotation, medical care, etc. And morale, it isn't everything in an army, but it's most of it. Because you can have the best weapons, the best vehicles, you can have overwhelming numbers, but if you don't have people who want to fight, and they're going to stop fighting. And we know that happens. And Russia should be more aware of it than anything, because in its history, military defeat is the handmaiden of political change. So if I were Mr. Putin, I'd be watching this very carefully.
Chuck, that's a very, very nice note that we can end on and something we can look forward to. I appreciate your time today and thank you for your service.
Thanks, Jason.